Have you ever planted a tree and wondered what it might look like many years later? Not next week, not next month, but 10 years from now. Or 20, a tree grows slowly. At first, it is only a small stick in the ground, a few leaves, a thin trunk. It looks fragile, almost too small to matter. But time is powerful. Rain falls. Sunlight arrives every morning. Seasons change again and again, and slowly, that small tree begins to grow. This is the story of a man who understood something very simple. Small actions, repeated patiently, can quietly change the world. His name was Daniel Harper. Most people in his town simply called him Mr. Harper. He was 70 years old when this story truly began. But the seeds of the story had started much earlier. For 43 years, Daniel Harper worked as a city maintenance worker. It was not a glamorous job. He repaired sidewalks, cleaned public parks, trimmed old trees along the streets. Sometimes he fixed broken benches. Sometimes he painted fences. Sometimes he simply walked through parks collecting trash. Most people never noticed him, but Daniel noticed everything. He noticed the way sunlight moved through the branches of old trees. He noticed how birds built their nests in quiet corners of the park. He noticed how children always ran toward the shady places under large trees during hot summer afternoons. Over the years, Daniel learned something important. A city without trees feels different. The air feels heavier, the streets feel louder, the heat feels stronger. But when trees grow in a place, everything changes. The air becomes cooler, birds return, people sit longer on park benches, children stay outside longer. Daniel loved trees, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, respectful way. The kind of respect that grows slowly over many years. Every morning before work, Daniel drank his coffee on the small porch of his house. His home stood at the end of a quiet street. Across the road was an empty piece of land. It was large, roughly the size of 2 football fields. But it had been empty for as long as Daniel could remember. Years earlier, someone had planned to build houses there, but the project had failed. The land remained untouched, just dry grass, a few scattered weeds, and bare soil under the summer sun. Every morning, Daniel looked at that empty land. Most people saw nothing there. But Daniel imagined something different. He imagined shade. He imagined birds. He imagined a small forest. For many years, that idea stayed only in his imagination. Life was busy. Work required his attention. There were bills to pay, repairs to make, daily routines to follow. But time moves quietly forward, and eventually, Daniel reached retirement. One Friday afternoon, his coworkers gathered in the maintenance garage. Someone brought a cake, someone else brought coffee. They thanked Daniel for his long years of work. They shook his hand. Some of them even gave him a small gift. Daniel smiled politely through the entire event. He appreciated their kindness. But when the celebration ended and he walked home that evening, something felt different. For the first time in 43 years, he did not have to wake up for work the next morning. The next day felt strangely quiet. Daniel woke up early out of habit. He made his coffee. He sat on the porch, and he looked across the road at the empty land. The morning air was cool. A soft wind moved the tall grass. A few birds flew across the open space. Daniel sat there for a long time, longer than usual. For the first time in many years, he had time to think. Real time, unrushed time. He asked himself a simple question. What should I do now? Some retirees travel. Some spend more time with family. Some find hobbies. Some simply rest. Daniel thought about all those possibilities. But his eyes kept returning to the empty land. He imagined rows of trees there, tall ones, small ones, young trees growing slowly over time. Suddenly, a small idea appeared in his mind. It was not a grand plan. It was not a complicated project. It was just one simple thought. What if I planted a tree? Just one tree. Daniel sat quietly with that idea. He took a slow sip of coffee. Then he nodded slightly to himself. Yes, that seemed like a good place to start. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked to a small garden shop on the edge of town. The shop smelled of soil and fresh plants. Rows of young trees stood outside in large containers: maple trees, oak trees, pine trees, cherry trees. A young employee greeted him. "Can I help you find something?" Daniel looked at the trees for a moment. "Yes," he said calmly. "I think I'd like to buy a tree." The employee smiled. "Ah, planting it in your yard?" Daniel shook his head gently. "No." He looked toward the sky for a moment, as if imagining the future. "I'm planting it across the road." The employee seemed slightly confused but nodded politely. "Well, you have many good options here." Daniel chose a young maple tree. It was small, barely taller than his shoulder, but its leaves were bright green and healthy. He carried it home slowly in his truck. That evening, as the sun began to lower in the sky, Daniel walked across the road with the shovel. The land was quiet. No houses, no fences, just open space. He found a spot near the center of the field. Then he began to dig. The soil was dry at first, but a few inches below the surface, it became darker and softer. Daniel worked patiently. The hole slowly became deeper, wide enough for the young tree's roots. After nearly 20 minutes, the hole was ready. Daniel carefully placed the small maple tree into the ground. Then he filled the hole with soil again, pressing the earth gently around the roots. Finally, he stepped back and looked at it. One tree, standing alone in the wide open field. It did not look like much, just a small green shape against a large, empty landscape. But Daniel smiled quietly, because in his mind, this was only the beginning. The next morning, Daniel sat on his porch again with a cup of coffee. He looked across the road. The small tree stood there in the early sunlight. Its leaves moved softly in the breeze. Daniel took a deep breath. And for the first time since retiring, he felt a new sense of purpose. He didn't know exactly how the idea would grow. He didn't know how long it would take, but one thought slowly formed in his mind: maybe next week, I will plant another tree. The following week arrived quietly. Daniel did not rush. He had no schedule to follow anymore, no clock telling him where to be, but he still woke up early, just like he had done for most of his life. The morning sun rose slowly above the houses across the street. Daniel sat on his porch with a warm cup of coffee in his hands. This had become his favorite moment of the day, a quiet start, a calm beginning. Across the road, the small maple tree stood alone in the open field. Its leaves moved gently in the wind. It was still small, still fragile, but it looked alive and hopeful in the morning light. Daniel studied it carefully. He had planted many trees during his years working in city parks. But something felt different this time. This tree was not part of a job. No one had asked him to plant it. No supervisor was watching. No schedule required it. He had planted it simply because he wanted to, and that made it feel special. After finishing his coffee, Daniel stood up slowly. He stretched his arms and looked across the road again. Then he smiled slightly. "Well," he said quietly to himself, "I think it's time for another one." Later that morning, Daniel returned to the same garden shop. The young employee recognized him immediately. "Oh, hello again," the young man said with a friendly smile. "Back for another tree?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, I think so." The employee seemed curious. "Did the first one survive?" Daniel smiled gently. "It's doing well." Then he added something thoughtful. "I am planning to plant one every week." The employee raised his eyebrows slightly. "Every week?" Daniel nodded calmly. "Yes, it seems like a good pace." The young man laughed softly. "Well, if you keep coming back, we'll always have trees ready for you." This time, Daniel chose a small oak tree. It was slightly taller than the maple. Its leaves were darker, stronger. Oaks were known for growing slowly but becoming very powerful over time. Daniel loaded the tree carefully into the back of his truck and drove home. That evening, as the sky began to turn orange and gold, he carried the young oak across the road. The field looked wide and open as always, but now something had changed. One tree already stood near the center. Daniel walked a short distance away from the maple. He didn't want the trees too close together. Trees needed space to grow, space for their roots, space for their branches. He pushed the shovel into the soil again. The familiar rhythm returned. Dig, lift, turn, dig again. The work felt satisfying, not exhausting, just steady and peaceful. After some time, the hole was ready. Daniel gently lowered the oak tree into the ground. Then he covered the roots with fresh soil, pressing the earth down carefully. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at the field. Two trees now stood there, a maple and an oak. They were still small, still far apart, but together they already looked different from the empty land that had been there before. Daniel crossed his arms and studied them quietly. The evening breeze moved the leaves gently. It almost looked like the two trees were greeting each other. Daniel smiled. The next morning, he sat on his porch again, coffee in hand, watching the field. Two trees, standing together in the early light. It was a simple sight, but something inside him felt peaceful. Days passed slowly. Daniel developed a comfortable routine: morning coffee on the porch, a walk through the neighborhood, reading a few pages from a book, sometimes visiting the small grocery store in town. Retirement, he realized, was not about doing nothing. It was about having time. Time to notice small things. Time to move slowly. Time to think. And every week, he returned to the garden shop. Week 3 brought a young pine tree. Week 4 brought a cherry tree. Week 5 brought another maple. And each tree found its place in the wide field across the road. Daniel spaced them carefully. He imagined how they might grow years later, where their branches would stretch, where their shadows would fall. The field slowly began to change. At first, most people did not notice. From a distance, the trees still looked very small. But Daniel noticed everything. He noticed how the soil held moisture longer near the trees. He noticed insects gathering around the leaves. He noticed birds occasionally landing on the thin branches. One afternoon, while Daniel was watering the trees with a long garden hose, a woman walking her dog slowed down near the road. She watched him for a moment. "Excuse me," she called. Daniel looked up and waved politely. "Yes?" The woman pointed toward the trees. "Did you plant those?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, I did." The woman looked surprised. "All of them?" Daniel smiled gently. "Well, so far." The woman stepped closer to the edge of the field. Her dog sniffed the grass curiously. "They look nice," she said. "Are you starting a garden?" Daniel shook his head. "Not exactly." He paused for a moment before answering. I think I'm starting a forest. The woman laughed kindly. A forest? Daniel nodded calmly. Yes, eventually. The woman looked at the small trees again. Then she smiled warmly. Well, she said, every forest must start somewhere. After she continued her walk, Daniel thought about her words. Every forest must start somewhere. That sentence stayed in his mind for the rest of the day. Weeks continued to pass. Spring slowly turned into early summer. The sun grew warmer. The grass grew taller. And every week, Daniel planted another tree. Sometimes he chose tall species, sometimes smaller flowering trees, sometimes trees that would grow wide and provide shade. The field slowly changed. At first, the trees looked scattered, but as their numbers grew, a pattern began to appear. Small groups of trees, rows of green, little islands of shade forming across the land. Daniel often stood quietly in the field after planting, looking around, imagining the future. He imagined children playing here one day. He imagined people sitting under the shade. He imagined birds building nests high in the branches. For now, those images lived only in his imagination. But that did not bother him. Daniel had learned something important during his years working in city parks. Good things take time. You cannot rush a tree. You cannot force a forest to appear in a single day. But if you care for the land patiently and repeat small actions consistently, something beautiful can slowly grow. By the end of the first summer, 12 trees stood across the once empty field. 12 quiet beginnings. They were still young, still thin, still growing. But together they had already started changing the feeling of the place. The land no longer looked empty. It looked hopeful. And Daniel, standing quietly among the young trees one evening, realized something important. Planting trees was not just about the future, it was also about the present. Each tree gave him something to care for, something to nurture, something to look forward to every week. And as the sun slowly set behind the growing line of trees, Daniel placed his shovel over his shoulder and began walking back toward his house. Next week, he thought calmly, there will be another tree. Summer continued slowly in Daniel's small town. The days were long and warm. Sunlight stretched across the empty field from early morning until late evening. But the field was not truly empty anymore. 14 young trees now stood across the land. Some were maples, some were oaks, a few were pine trees, and one small cherry tree had already started growing delicate green leaves. Daniel continued his quiet routine. Every morning, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. Every morning, he looked across the road, and every morning, he noticed something new. One day, the maple tree had grown 2 new branches. Another day, the pine tree looked slightly taller. Sometimes a bird rested on one of the thin branches. Small changes, quiet changes, but Daniel noticed all of them. The trees were still young, of course. From far away, they looked like small green dots in a wide field. But to Daniel, each one felt important. He remembered exactly when he planted each tree. The maple was first, the oak was second, the pine tree came during the 3rd week, the cherry tree during the 4th. They were like quiet chapters in a new part of his life. One afternoon, Daniel walked across the road carrying a small bucket of water. The summer had been dry that week. The young trees needed extra care. As he slowly watered the soil around the roots, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around. 2 children were standing near the edge of the field, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. They were holding bicycles. Both looked curious. "Hello," the boy said. Daniel smiled kindly. "Hello?" The girl pointed toward the trees. Did you plant these? Daniel nodded. Yes, I planted them. The boy stepped a little closer. Why? Daniel thought about the question for a moment. Children often ask simple questions that adults forgot to ask. Because this land looked lonely, he said calmly, and I thought trees might like living here. The children looked at each other. Then they looked at the trees again. The girl smiled. They look nice. Daniel nodded. Thank you. The boy tilted his head thoughtfully. Are you going to plant more? Daniel smiled again. Yes. One every week. The boy's eyes widened. That's a lot of trees. Daniel chuckled softly. Eventually, yes. The children stood there for a moment, quietly looking at the small trees. Then the girl asked another question. Will it become a forest? Daniel looked across the field. The warm wind moved through the tall grass. The young leaves of the trees shimmered in the sunlight. Yes, he said gently. One day, I think it will. The boy grinned. That would be cool. After a few minutes, the children climbed back onto their bicycles and rode away down the street. But before leaving, the girl turned around and waved. Good luck with your forest. Daniel waved back. Thank you. That evening, Daniel sat on his porch again. The sun was setting slowly behind the trees. The sky turned shades of orange and soft purple, and for the first time, the young trees created small shadows across the field. Daniel noticed something interesting. The land did not feel as empty anymore. Even with only 14 trees, the space had started to change. It felt softer, more alive, more welcoming. Weeks passed. Daniel continued visiting the garden shop every Saturday morning. The young employee had grown used to seeing him. Another tree today? The employee would ask with a smile. Yes, Daniel would reply calmly. Just one. Sometimes Daniel chose trees that grew tall and strong. Other times he chose trees with wide branches that would create shade. Occasionally, he selected trees that would produce flowers in spring. The field slowly became more interesting, more colorful, more diverse. By the end of the summer, 22 trees stood across the land. From the road, people had started to notice. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to look. Drivers passing through the street sometimes turned their heads. One evening, Daniel was planting his newest tree when an older man approached from the sidewalk. The man leaned on a walking cane. He watched Daniel for a moment before speaking. You've been busy out here, the man said. Daniel looked up and smiled politely. Yes. A little. The man looked across the field. There used to be nothing here. Daniel nodded. Yes. I remember. The man studied the trees quietly. They look good. Daniel appreciated the compliment. Thank you. The man pointed toward the field. How many so far? Daniel wiped the soil from his hands and thought for a moment. 22. The man nodded slowly. That's impressive. He looked at Daniel with curiosity. You planning to stop at some point? Daniel smiled gently. I haven't decided yet. The man laughed softly. Well, at this rate, you might end up with a forest. Daniel looked at the young trees again. Yes, he said calmly. That's the idea. As autumn slowly approached, the weather began to change. Cooler winds moved through the town. The leaves on the maple trees began turning shades of gold and red. For the first time, the small field across the road showed colors, tiny bursts of autumn among the young trees. Daniel found himself spending more time outside. Sometimes he brought a folding chair to the field. He would sit quietly and read a book while listening to the wind moving through the leaves. Other times, he simply watched the sky. the trees continued growing quietly, their roots reaching deeper into the soil, their branches stretching slowly toward the sunlight. Daniel realized something important during those quiet afternoons. Planting the trees was only part of the experience. Watching them grow was equally meaningful. Growth takes patience. Real change happens slowly. By the time the first cold days of autumn arrived, Daniel had planted 28 trees, 28 quiet beginnings. One evening, as he stood in the middle of the field looking at the small collection of trees, Daniel imagined what the place might look like years from now. Tall trunks, wide branches, birds singing in the morning, children playing in the shade. The thought made him smile. For now, the forest existed mostly in his imagination, but imagination was often the first step in creating something real. Daniel picked up his shovel and began walking back toward his house as the sun dipped below the horizon. Next week, he thought calmly, there will be another tree. Autumn slowly settled over Daniel's town. The air became cooler. Morning sunlight arrived a little later each day, and the leaves of the young trees across the field began to change color. From his porch, Daniel could now see small touches of gold and orange moving gently in the wind. The maple trees were the first to change. Their leaves turned bright shades of red and amber. The oak trees followed more slowly, their leaves becoming darker and deeper in color. Even though the trees were still young, the field no longer looked empty. Something had started to grow there, not just trees, but a feeling. Daniel noticed that people were beginning to slow down when they passed the road. Some drivers glanced at the field through their car windows. Walkers stopped for a moment before continuing down the sidewalk. The place had become interesting. One quiet afternoon, Daniel carried his shovel across the road to plant the next tree. The wind was cool, but the sky was clear and bright. Fallen leaves from nearby streets rolled gently across the grass. As Daniel began digging, he heard the sound of footsteps again. This time, it was not children. It was the same woman with the dog he had spoken to months earlier. Her dog walked happily beside her, or sniffing the ground as they approached the field. "Hello again," she called. Daniel looked up and smiled. "Hello." The woman stopped at the edge of the field and looked around. Her eyes moved slowly from one tree to another. "Well," she said with a warm laugh, "you weren't joking about the forest idea." Daniel chuckled quietly. "I'm still working on it." The woman stepped a little closer. Her dog walked carefully between two of the young trees. "How many are there now?" she asked. Daniel leaned on his shovel and thought for a moment. 34. The woman's eyes widened. 34 trees? Daniel nodded calmly. "Yes, one every week." She looked around again. "You know, it's starting to look really nice." Daniel appreciated the comment. "Thank you." The woman watched him continue digging. You must enjoy doing this," she said. Daniel nodded. "I do." She tilted her head slightly. "But it must take a lot of patience." Daniel paused for a moment. Then he answered slowly. "Yes. But patience is not so difficult when you know the trees will grow." The woman smiled thoughtfully. "That's a beautiful way to think about it." After a short conversation, she continued walking her dog down the street. But before leaving, she turned and said one more thing. "I hope you keep going." Daniel smiled. "I plan to." Weeks passed quietly. The wind grew colder. Leaves continued falling from nearby streets and yards. Many of them gathered around the young trees in the field. Daniel noticed that the fallen leaves created a natural blanket over the soil. This helped protect the roots from the coming winter. He had learned many small lessons during his years working in city parks. Nature often knew how to take care of itself if people simply gave it a chance. One Saturday morning, Daniel walked to the garden shop again. The young employee greeted him with the usual smile. "Let me guess," the employee said. "Another tree?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." The employee laughed. "You're becoming our most loyal customer." Daniel smiled politely. "Well, trees make good neighbors." That day, Daniel chose a small birch tree. Its thin white trunk looked delicate, but birch trees were strong and adaptable. They grew beautifully in cool climates. As Daniel loaded the tree into his truck, the employee asked a curious question. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded. "Of course." The employee leaned against the counter. "Why only one tree each week?" "You could plant more if you wanted." Daniel thought about that question carefully. Then he gave a calm answer. "One tree is enough." The employee looked puzzled. Daniel continued speaking. "If I planted 20 trees in one day, the field would change quickly. But I would miss something important." "What's that?" the employee asked. Daniel smiled gently. "The experience of watching it grow." The employee nodded slowly. "I think I understand." Daniel picked up the young birch tree and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he added one more thought. Good things take time. And when you move slowly, you notice more. That evening, Daniel planted the birch tree near the northern side of the field. The soil was cooler now. The air carried the quiet smell of approaching winter. After finishing the work, Daniel stood still for a moment. 35 trees now lived across the land. They were still young, still thin, but together they had begun forming small clusters. When the wind moved through the field, the branches swayed softly. The leaves whispered against each other. It was a peaceful sound. Soon, winter arrived. The first frost covered the grass in the early mornings. The trees dropped their final leaves. Bare branches stretched toward the gray sky. From his porch, Daniel now saw a very different landscape. Rows of quiet tree trunks standing patiently across the field. But Daniel did not worry. Winter was not an ending. It was simply another season in the life of a tree. Even during the coldest months, the roots continued growing slowly underground, preparing for spring. Daniel continued his weekly tradition, even in the cold. Some Saturdays were windy, some were cloudy. Once or twice, light snow covered the ground. But Daniel still carried a tree across the road, still dug a hole in the soil, still planted another quiet beginning. Neighbors began to notice his dedication. One afternoon, the two children with bicycles returned to the field. They rode carefully between the young trees. The boy looked around in amazement. "There are so many now," he said. The girl nodded excitedly. "It really is becoming a forest." Daniel laughed softly. "Not yet, but it's getting closer." The children rode their bicycles slowly through the rows of trees. Their laughter filled the cold winter air. Daniel watched them with a warm smile. For the first time, and the field was not just a place for trees, it was becoming a place for people too. That evening, as Daniel walked back toward his house, he turned around one last time. The field stood quietly under the pale winter sky. Dozens of young trees waited patiently for spring. Daniel felt a deep sense of calm. He knew something important had begun here, something that would continue growing long after he finished planting trees. Next week, he thought once again, there will be another tree. Winter passed slowly in Daniel's town. Cold mornings covered the grass with frost. Thin layers of snow sometimes appeared overnight and quietly melted by afternoon. The young trees across the field stood still and patient under the pale winter sky. From his porch, Daniel could see their thin branches reaching upward like quiet fingers, and they looked fragile, almost delicate. But Daniel knew better. Trees were stronger than they looked. Beneath the frozen soil, their roots were alive, slowly growing deeper, slowly preparing for spring. Daniel continued his routine even during the cold months. Every week, he visited the garden shop. Every week, he planted another tree. Sometimes the ground was hard and required extra effort to dig. Sometimes the wind was sharp and cold against his face. But Daniel never skipped a week. Planting a tree had become part of his life, a quiet promise he kept with himself. By the end of winter, 47 trees stood across the field. They looked like a small gathering of patient friends waiting for warmer days. Then one morning, something changed. The air felt softer. The sunlight lasted a little longer, and tiny green buds began appearing on the branches of the maple trees. Spring had returned. Daniel noticed the change immediately. He sat on his porch with his coffee and smiled quietly. The trees had survived their first winter. Soon, small leaves began opening. The field slowly filled with shades of fresh green. Birds returned first. A pair of sparrows landed on one of the oak trees. They hopped along the branches and chirped happily. A few days later, Daniel noticed a robin building a nest in the taller maple tree. Twigs and dry grass slowly formed a small home between two branches. Daniel watched the birds for a long time. The forest was still young, but life had already begun to gather there. The changes did not go unnoticed by the neighborhood either. More people began walking near the field. Children rode bicycles between the rows of trees. Dog walkers paused to enjoy the quiet space. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel was watering the trees when a small group of neighbors approached. The woman with the dog was there, the older man with the walking cane, and the two children with their bicycles. They stood together near the edge of the field. The older man spoke first. "You've been busy again," he said with a smile. Daniel nodded. "A little." The woman looked around at the growing collection of trees. "I counted them yesterday," she said. 45. Daniel laughed softly. "There are 2 more now." The children looked excited. "That's almost 50, the boy said. The girl pointed toward the center of the field. "It's starting to look like a real forest." Daniel looked across the land. Rows of young trees stretched gently across the open space. Some were taller now, some had thicker branches. The cherry tree had even begun producing small pink flowers. "Yes," Daniel said quietly, "I think it's beginning." The neighbors stood there together for a moment. The wind moved gently through the leaves. Birds chirped above them. Then the woman said something thoughtful. "You know, this place has changed our neighborhood." Daniel looked surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "People walk here now. Children play here. My dog loves coming here," the older man added with a quiet laugh. "And I finally have somewhere peaceful to sit during my afternoon walks." Daniel felt something warm inside his chest. He had planted the trees for the land, for the future. But he had not expected how quickly the place would bring people together. The boy suddenly asked an important question. "How many trees will you plant?" Daniel looked across the field again. He had never set a final number. He had simply kept planting one each week. He thought about the question for a moment. Then he smiled gently. "I suppose I'll keep planting until it feels like enough." The girl nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. Over the next few years, Daniel continued his quiet project. Week after week, tree after tree. Spring turned to summer. Summer turned to autumn. Autumn returned to winter again and again. The trees grew taller. Their branches spread wider. Their roots held the soil firmly in place. The field slowly transformed into something remarkable. A small forest began to appear. Paths formed naturally where people walked between the trees. Children played games under the growing shade. Birds built nests high above the ground. One summer afternoon, Daniel sat on a wooden bench someone had placed beneath a tall oak tree. He had not built the bench. A neighbor had quietly added it one weekend. From that bench, Daniel could see something beautiful. Layers of green leaves moving gently in the sunlight, birds flying between branches, children laughing somewhere in the distance. The once empty field had become a living place. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and listened to the sound of wind moving through the trees. It sounded like a quiet conversation. Years passed. Eventually, the small trees became tall enough to cast wide shadows across the land. In spring, flowers bloomed. In autumn, golden leaves covered the ground like a soft blanket. And Daniel, now older and slower, still visited the forest often. Sometimes he carried a shovel. Sometimes he simply carried a cup of coffee and sat quietly among the trees. One peaceful morning, the two children who had once visited with their bicycles returned again. But they were no longer small children. They were teenagers now. They walked along the shaded path and found Daniel sitting on the bench. The boy smiled. "Mr. Harper?" Daniel looked up and smiled warmly. "I remember you two." The girl laughed. "You planted all of this." Daniel shook his head gently. "No." He looked around at the forest. "Time planted most of it." They sat together quietly for a moment. Birds sang in the branches above them. Sunlight filtered through thousands of green leaves. Finally, the boy asked a final question. "Why did you start planting trees?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. Then he said something simple. "Because small things grow." He looked at the tall trees surrounding them. And when you do small good things again and again, they can become something much bigger than you ever expected. The young forest moved gently in the wind. Leaves whispered above their heads, and Daniel felt peaceful knowing that long after he was gone, the trees would still be growing. Thank you for listening to this calm English story. Sometimes the quietest actions create the greatest changes, and sometimes a single tree, planted patiently each week, can slowly grow into a forest for everyone.